Live by the looks of it. So, hello everybody. My LinkedIn has just bleeped up because we're missing a speaker, and he's just messaged me now. So I will just send him over a link because he's lost it. But in the meantime, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us on this webinar today on Wednesday afternoon in the UK. I'm joined by a fantastic panel of speakers. So today we're going to be talking about voice, audio, and sonic branding with a slant towards employer branding and recruitment marketing. So how do we engage with job seekers and with job applicants and with people who are job candidates using audio, sound, and various technologies that come along with it. So without further ado, let me introduce my esteemed panel for the day. So we have got James J.P. Porter, CEO of Vixen Labs, based over here in the UK. We've got John Sanfilippo from, I'm terrible at pronouncing names, so correct me if I'm wrong. Good, excellent. I was looking at it and reading it at the same time phonetically. You saw how my brain kind of stopped there. So we've got John from Titan Sound. He's a sound strategist over in Canada. We've got Ron Jaworski, the CEO of, my brain has literally gone blank here, of Trinity Audio, sorry, based over in Tel Aviv in Israel. And we've got Ben McCulloch, a freelance sound producer and conversation designer. Ben, whereabouts are you based in the world nowadays? You're in, where are you nowadays?
In the Czech Republic. I'm from Scotland, but I'm in Brno in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, and I want to double check that because I thought it was, but yeah, it's the accent that throws me every single time. Good stuff. So the aim of today is to, like I said, go through some of our thoughts, some of our questions and queries around how we can potentially use audio, voice, and sound, and all the related technology around that to engage with people who are through the job application process, and maybe some other related use cases as well. So without further ado, why don't I've done a very, very short intro to everybody, but why don't I just hand over to everybody in order to have a bit of a deeper intro into them and their businesses so that we can understand exactly who it is in front of us. Why don't we start with you first, James, JP?
Hey everybody, nice to see all of you, and some familiar faces on the panel as well, which is always fun. I'm James Poulter. Most people know me as JP. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Vixen Labs, which is one of the world's and certainly Europe's kind of largest voice and dedicated voice agencies. We particularly work across voice and conversational technologies, mostly for large Fortune 500, FTSE 500 type brands, helping them navigate what to do with voice technology, whether that's on smart speakers or smartphones, whether that's on the web or through applications. And a large part of that obviously is about user experiences and audio in particular, whether that's the audio that goes into a voice application or whether that's into podcasts and content, or just the way in which your voice of your brand kind of comes about through either be that synthetic voices or through kind of audio casting as well. So a real blend. And yeah, we've been working in this space now for a number of years. Myself personally came from working in the kind of agency background and then spent some time in-house at the Lego Group, leading emerging technologies there, where we first got kind of really into voice, and then launched Vixen Labs about 3.5 years ago with my co-founder Jen. And since then, we've been building a team based here in the UK and now in Germany and the US as well. So nice to be here. Nice to see you all.
Awesome. Thanks, JP. We could talk for hours about Lego and the very, very famous kind of branding and voices around Lego right now.
I've got some collection behind me at some point, which I can show you. Maybe not.
We'll definitely have to leave that for another time. I could talk forever about Lego. Now I've got kids that are into it as well, which is even brilliant. Cool. Let's go over to John. John, why don't you give us a bit of a deeper introduction to yourself?
Hello, my name's John Sanfilippo. I run Titan Sound here in Kingston, Ontario, which is just east of Toronto. And yeah, I've been running it it's actually been 10 years this past January. So very excited about that. Basically, when I was a little kid, I played around with tape recorders, playing radio. In my teens, I started playing music, as you can see behind me. In my 20s, I got into media and advertising. And then in my 30s, I finally found a way to put them all together into audio branding and production. So basically, I work with brands to create sonic identities and sonic assets using music, voice, and sounds.
Pretty cool. And I've said this to you before, John, I know, but probably one of the coolest backdrops I've ever witnessed on a video call. I have to say, it's almost like a branch of the Hard Rock Cafe going on in there. It's pretty cool.
You just 4 guitars, but when this kind of interaction became normal, I had to make it symmetrical. So yeah.
I don't blame you at all. I would have to do exactly the same. Cool. Thanks, John. Why don't we head over to Ron? Ron, why don't you give us a bit of an intro to you and the business?
So, first of all, pleasure being here. My name is Ron Jaworski. I'm the CEO and founder of Trinity Audio. Myself am quite an audiophile. Love to listen to the spoken word, especially in an audio format, whether it's on radio, podcast, or whatnot. Trinity Audio started as an idea about 5 years ago, where our vision basically is to help audify the internet, as we call it, and basically take any textual asset out there and have it accessible in an audio form, as we call it, first of all, the audification of it, and then, of course, the distribution of it. Today, Trinity Audio is working globally in a lot of different markets, supports over 60 different languages across the globe. And we are excited to create the largest audio library in the planet.
Really cool. Thank you. And yeah, love the tech as well. It's absolutely brilliant. Ben, why don't we swing over to you, and why don't you introduce yourself a little bit more so than I did earlier?
Sure, thanks, Martin. I have to say I have the least cool background as well. I do have a sleeping cat just behind me, but you know,
I've got a headdress by the look of it. I'm trying to position myself so it doesn't look like I've got a plant sticking out the top of my head. But
it's a good look. It's a good look.
I think so. Yeah.
That's your branding right now.
There we go. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
No worries. So I guess similar to John, I started with recording sounds on the west coast of Scotland. I was mostly recording waves on the beach because I lived on a little island. And I still find myself listening to those recordings because, you know, I'm just obsessed with sound. I studied music and then sound engineering. And when I moved to the Czech Republic, I was working in dialogue for post-production, like film, TV, video games. So really focused on the nuances of voice, you know, how we use it to present material, what's right for different scenarios. Also did sound design for TV shows and video games. Then I got into localization, so basically continuing in the sort of dialogue space, but localizing voiceovers for brands like Microsoft and so on, in all languages around the world. And that was where I discovered conversation design. So that's where I'm focused now as a freelance conversation designer. And in terms of sonic branding, I feel like really I'm Padawan, you know what I mean? Like in the whole Jedi way of maturing. I'm really Padawan level. I'm super excited about it, and I co-host the Voice Lunch audio and branding with Colleen Fahey, and she is like Jedi master of sonic branding. So I sort of front the audio production side, and for me, you know, audio branding, it's extremely exciting. This is a new area that's opening up, and I see so many opportunities in the space. You know, it's really exciting to see everything that's happening. And thanks for putting together this panel. Like all of the other presenters, I'm very keen to hear what they've got to say.
That's brilliant, thank you. And you mentioned something there that's obviously close to my heart, which is conversation design, and that you're a conversation designer. And obviously, the audience we've got today are more kind of focused on recruitment and HR and kind of related areas. So, for the benefit of the audience, can you just give us a very, very, very quick synopsis of what a conversation designer does and what conversation design is? I mean, I know I talk about it all the time with these people, but it'd be good to hear it from somebody else.
Yeah, sure. So, what a conversation designer does is primarily researches the needs. Like not everybody who wants to create a conversational design has a good use case for it. So you have to do a ton of research to make sure you're actually building something that the world needs and will benefit people. And then beyond that, you are writing what the bot says, bot as in Alexa or Google Assistant or Siri or any of the others. And then a lot and lots and lots and lots of testing, because the technology is new and everything needs to be refined and iterated, and your assumptions of how people talk are usually in some way wrong. You can't imagine everything that people are going to say, and I think that's one of the things about designing for voice. Each of us, 5 people in this call, we all have our own unique way of talking. If you spread that out to the world, you've got 8 billion people who each have their own unique way of talking. So it's about considering the needs of the brand and how it wants to speak, and then the needs of the users and how they speak, and putting the use case in between and making it work. I wonder JP could probably sum that up even better, but that's my attempt.
No, I'll take that. I'll take that description better. I think you did an admirable job.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really cool.
Thanks.
And I should have put a warning at the beginning of this show to say that we'll probably be mentioning the words Alexa and Siri and things like that, quite a lot during that show. So if you have got any of those devices hanging around and you don't want them activating continuously, then now's the time to turn off their microphones or put your headphones on. So I should have probably done. It's like an episode of South Park, isn't it, where they did that continuously just to annoy everyone. Anyway, thanks for that, Ben. Appreciate it. So look, let's hand over to John as the start of this kind of real conversation, kind of diving into it. From your perspective, John, how would you define sonic branding, and why is it so important for a business to consider it?
Yeah, so sonic branding, it's also called audio branding. The terms are used interchangeably. I appreciate Ben's use of the Jedi analogy. I'm probably like Jedi Knight level, not quite the beginner, but not Jedi Master like Colleen. So yeah, I'm probably somewhere in the middle there. But basically with sonic branding, we want to look at the brand and get an idea of how to express it sonically. And it's a really interesting time to be in this business, because partly of some of the work that my colleagues here are involved in, the technology is just blowing up and the media is blowing up. Things like voice technology and smart speakers and podcasts are all over the place. And there are so many brands that find themselves in a position where they've been hypervisual for their entire existence. And when you're in that position and you find yourself in an audio-only arena, none of that media carries over. So what we want to do is take a good look at the brand, and we approach it very much the way you would approach traditional visual branding, where you have consistent color and logo and typeface all across the board. And we're doing basically the same thing, except that we're using music, voice, and sounds. And the process is very similar too, in that we'll sort of look at the brand, and we start with what I like to call an audio audit, and we'll sort of take a look at how much audio media you're actually using and you're actually putting out. And it's typically a lot more than you realize. So once we take kind of an inventory of what I would call the sonic footprint of the brand, Then we'll kind of get to the guts of it. We do the brand audit. So we want to get an understanding of what is its function and how does it make people feel and how do we want people to feel and how does it fit into the world? How does it make the world a better place? And it's interesting with audio branding because you do have to, I think, get a bit deeper than you do with traditional visual branding because quite often visuals convey information, but sounds convey emotion. And the emotion is what's really going to, that's how you connect with people. And there are stats out there that say, something like, 80% of purchase intent is emotional. I've seen it go as high as 90, but it's always a very high number. So it's all about building a relationship with the audience and doing it long term too. And that's the thing is once you have your identity established, you have to stick with it and be consistent all across the board through all your media. That's kind of the gist of it. I could talk all day about this stuff, but I don't want to take up too much of the time here. Let's keep the things focused. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. And I love the thought process that, people connect emotionally with sound. And it's about conveying emotion rather than information. Obviously, we're coming at this from a people-focused process, recruitment, and obviously, there's nothing more emotional than trying to make a life decision like changing a job. So I totally get that, and the consistency piece I get as well, because obviously some of the people that are going to be watching this who are responsible for for employer branding and recruitment marketing, there may be already an audio branding strategy happening elsewhere in the business. So probably makes sense to ensure that if you are doing this from a recruitment perspective, that the audio is consistent with the rest of the brand. I mean, there's so many famous brands out there that use some very, very well recognized audio that it would make absolute sense, because immediately those people that you're targeting from a recruitment perspective have an emotional connection with the brand because they might have heard that audio and that sound elsewhere within the kind of more consumer focused positioning that it might be doing. So I totally get that.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing is you can talk about, what kind of identity do we want to build, and we're talking about recruitment. I think the question is, what kind of identity do we already have? Because the thing that I always preach with audio branding in particular is people will ask me, okay, well, what's the ROI for having an audio brand? And my response is, you already have an audio identity, whether you've designed it or not. It's not a matter of, is this going to bring a return on investment? It's using best practices to get the most out of the media that you're already producing. You're already making visual and auditory impressions. It's a question of, are we doing it right?
Yeah, no, I totally get that. That's really interesting. Thank you. James, I want to come over to you next, and thanks for that, John. We'll talk about that a little bit more a bit later, I think. JP, I want to come over to you because Vixen Labs, a voice marketing agency. So I want to kind of get a bit more of an understanding of what you mean by voice marketing, and why is voice marketing so important?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think that term has been used a lot in the industry as it's emerged over the past few years. It kind of captures a number of different facets of the marketing kind of suite, really. It's kind of a little bit like in the early days when you start talking about digital marketing, and then as somehow that was different from any other kind of marketing, and now that word almost feels slightly out of kilter with the world, because isn't all marketing somewhat digital in some way or another now? Anyway, obviously I know there are things that don't live on screens, but they're all produced on screens before they end up there, so hard to understand how that works. And voice marketing, I suppose, is kind of going in a similar direction. What we typically mean by that is it covers a few kind of core areas. One is essentially anything that comes out of a speaker at you, whether that's speaker might be coming out of your smart speaker. We mentioned a couple of those before, but it could be coming out of your phone. It could be coming out of your headphones. It could be coming out of the speakers in your car, or it could be coming out the speaker of, say, a retail destination. You're going through a drive-through or an ATM or a retail kiosk, wherever there is sound coming at you, and particularly when we talk about voice marketing, the spoken word and sound coming together. I would say it kind of encapsulates all of those different areas. Yeah, but what we particularly have focused in on, and I think a lot of the industry has focused on in recent years, is the kind of two-way aspect of that kind of conversational marketing, which you could almost say is a subset of voice marketing, and some people then do it the other way around and say, voice is a subset of conversational marketing. It's hard to kind of get these things right when the industry is so nascent. And what I mean by the interactive element of that is, I suppose, not only do we now think about the places where audio comes out, and I think, John, that's really, as you've been discussing, right? Like the sonic identity has been something that we have thought about as often, to begin with, a one-way thing. You're hearing that sonic identity, whether that's mixed audio of music, vocals, stings, idents, beds, and things like that from the world of radio, which is where I originally kind of started my career. Through to then actual voices and the role that voices play within that. And that might be the voices of presenters. It might be the voices of characters, if you're kind of an entertainment brand or something like that. And some of those voices now don't belong to anybody. They're entirely synthetically created, and they come out of nowhere. And that creates a whole new paradigm itself. So when we're talking about voice marketing, we're talking about the inputs and outputs to those voices. And that means thinking about the way a brand shows up through the speech it creates, the audio that goes along with that speech, whether that's musical or otherwise, as Ben was alluding to earlier, but also about the way in which a brand talks, the way in which a brand uses its voice and its conversational style and tone, and that's where we kind of get into this more interesting area. And I think the input side of that, if that's all the output, the input side of that is also then, how do you want consumers to talk to you? And in almost all cases, we talk about this idea of kind of in conversational marketing, of conversational objectives. Like, what is a user trying to get out of having a conversation with you as the brand or the business or community or individual, whatever it might be? There's an objective to a conversation. None of us start with the exception possibly of small talk, and even that has its own objective of just passing the time. None of us start a conversation without trying to get something out of it, right? Whether you're at a dinner table or you're talking to someone across a kind of kiosk or whatever it might be. So when a user starts talking to that brand, what's that user trying to get out of it? And what's the business trying to get out of it? And that's where a lot of the voice strategy work that we do at Vixen starts, is trying to understand conversational objectives. What are people trying to get out of those conversations with the brand? And that really impacts this whole world of sonic branding and audio branding, because then you don't just think about what musical tone it's using and how bright it is and what key it's in, or kind of what instrumentation or other things like that, but also like, what grammar does it use? Does it use slang? Does it have an accent? Is it from a region somewhere? Those types of things begin to factor in. Is it polite? Is it curt with you? Those types of questions. And that's where it gets, I think, really interesting about kind of what types of conversations brands want to enter into, and also what things they won't touch as well, which is particularly important. So yeah, in summary, I suppose voice marketing is thinking about all the potential ways that you can have a conversation with an audience, whoever that audience is, and in all the places that you could have it. And then typically that shows up in either content, so things like podcasts and news briefings and music and playlists and all that kind of stuff. It might show up in the form of an application, which is typically what a lot of the voice agencies similar to us have built over the past few years, which are conversational applications, things like Alexa Skills, Google Assistant Actions, capsules for Bixby, things like that. But increasingly, it's also optimizing the content that has for a long time lived on the web to be read out by these conversational assistants. And that's where the world of voice search really is the third big pillar within that kind of broad umbrella of voice marketing. So content, applications, and search. And the search bit is because 9 times out of 10, when you ask an assistant in any context for a question, the answer you're going to get is coming probably from Google or somewhere else on the web. And most of the time that answer is not great. And often coming from a place that isn't owned by the source of the information. It's coming from an aggregator like Wikipedia or Amazon, or it's coming from one of the content libraries, like Spotify or something like that. And so, that third big area is really helping brands and businesses work out how to optimize their content for when someone searches and gets the right answer.
That's really interesting, because obviously we've gone through this this whole kind of spectrum of content optimization, haven't we, as businesses, from, you know, kind of the written content, and now everyone's kind of talking about video because that's kind of, you know, scoring high on Google and things like that now. And then, yeah, now we're talking about optimizing your content for voice search. That's really, really interesting. So I know that Vixen Labs for the last 2 years has been producing the Voice Consumer Index, and I know you've got another one coming out again this year.
Yeah,
so yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Actually, it's one of my highlights of the year for just, you know, arguing the point of why voice. But do you want to give us a bit of an overview, just some headline stats around what's going on the consumer side of things when it comes to voice? I know it covers UK, US, and Germany this year. Is that correct? So why don't you give us a bit of an overview of what's going on? Maybe kind of, you know, here, US, Germany, kind of break it down a bit if that's
yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the study that we've been running now, so we had a kind of infancy version of it in 2020, and then the fully fledged one last year.
It was that good. Okay, I don't know what's happened to JP there. Oh, here he comes back. Let's get him back on.
No, I lose you for a second there. One of the kids started streaming Encanto for the 17th time today. Sorry about
I feel
that.
your pain. No worries.
So I was saying, so the Voice Consumer Index, it's a study that we've run for the past couple of years in the UK, the US, and Germany, and looks at the patterns of behaviour from users or voice users, and that's not just smart speakers; that's all places that people use their voice. And one of the key things that we found, I suppose, when we started going into this, and why I think it's particularly pertinent to this conversation around recruitment and employment branding, is that people are using their voices to ask all sorts of questions across a really wide and broad range of topic areas, and including things like, you know, what it's like to work somewhere and what type of job I might want, and all those kind of questions too. But the biggest thing is that people are using their voices across many different types of devices in many different places. And I think one of the really important things to glean from that is that voice is no longer about smart speakers, right? Smart speakers represent a very significant portion of people's usage patterns. They're kind of, we talk often about them being the training wheels for voice. People get used to using their Alexa devices at home, for example, and then that trains them to then use their AirPods more. It trains them to use their car inbuilt speakers more. But this is no longer a smart speaker game. This is covering many different areas. And when people get into using their voice, they start really asking a much broader range of questions that I think many of us thought. You know, when you extract the normal things like playing music or you know, setting alarms and reminders and things like that, basically the next thing that people do the most, over 75% of people do this on a daily basis, is ask general questions to a search engine. And that a lot of that is unprompted. People just trying stuff out. They're searching around for the information they want, often when they are you know, just trying to get things done during the day. And then, you know, following on from that, the next thing that people do the most is search for specific product information or specific brand information about things in a local area. And so you think about the kind of crisis of you know, the big resignation that we're going on around the world at the moment, and people rethinking about the way in which they you know, think about where they want to work. This has, you know, kind of big impacts on the way in which you might go and talk to people about joining your company or thinking about a job, because people are going to be asking these types of questions to different devices. Now, they're probably not turning to Alexa whilst doing the washing up and saying, what's it like to work at KPMG, or, you know, what's the salary benchmark for Salesforce? I mean, they might be, but I don't think that's that likely. But, you know, take much more local jobs, for example, people who'd seen an ad in a window as they've been walking down the street about, you know, getting Starbucks is looking for new baristas, or, you know, like come and work for us in, you know, kind of this local laundrette or something. Those types of scenarios. That's the type of thing where people might be later on turning and using their phone just out of habit and asking Google on their phone, you know, find me the number for that place, or like look on Glassdoor for reviews of what it's like to work here. And so it's those types of big, broad searches that are beginning to gradually make up larger and larger total volumes of search coming through places like Google. But for the big companies, the other thing that we really see from the data is that there's been this massive increase in the use of, I suppose, kind of audio for an entertainment and an education medium. huge rise, as we know, during the pandemic of people using podcasts. And in particular, the places and times people use that audio has shifted. We've gone away from traditional morning and evening commuter patterns as people have begun to work from home. And a lot more people are using audio throughout the day as just a kind of companion and an accompaniment to their day. And I think the big thing, for that we've seen is that particularly using audio content, whether that is transcribed, kind of briefings from, I don't know, shareholder meetings through to actual podcasts being produced at much lower cost, and even things like this, webinars, which are a form of audio content. Many people who, they might want to sit here and look at us five guys kind of like chatting about this stuff, but I imagine many of you who are listening have probably got this in a tab that you're not particularly looking at. You're just hearing me coming over to you through the headphones. That is a form of audio and voice branding content, right? And it all kind of adds up to the way in which we're using audio as a means of keeping ourselves entertained and informed and moving ourselves through the day. And I think, again, that has a big potential opportunity space for brands and businesses to think about when it comes to their employment branding and their recruitment strategy, because how better can you understand what it's like to go work somewhere than hear from the people that work at that place and have conversations with those people? And I can say that the majority of people that we've hired at Vixen over the past couple of years, we've done remotely during the pandemic, many of them in different countries. Some of them I've never met in person. And but I have met them through these things, and they have met many members of our team by us being out there doing things like this, things like webinars, recording our own podcasts, things like that. And that's how people have come to know who we are. And, we're not a big firm, but we're doing that stuff as part of an active part of our own marketing strategy, because we know how powerful it is for people to have those long form bits of content that they get to know us through. And we're seeing that again from the data that people are using it more and more. So anyway, I've gone on, I'll shut up there. But
no, that's
a huge opportunity.
No, that's really interesting. And some really, really good food for thought there, I think. Certainly, we know that consumer behavior when it comes to voice is just increasing more and more every year as people, like you say, become really comfortable with utilizing audio and voice devices, whether that be on their desk at home as a smart speaker, whether that be in their car or on their earpods or anything like that. Absolutely, no, I totally get that. And actually, and it's something that there's a continuous argument in the world of recruitment about, is that, whether candidates are consumers or not. But ultimately, from my perspective, they have consumer behaviors because they are consumers outside of recruitment.
We all are, sadly.
It's exactly. Yeah, sadly we are.
That's why we commission the study in the way we do it, because we don't just look at some specific kind of like highly engaged population. We look at general public, and we learn from that this is what I'm talking about is the behavior that all of us as humans do in these markets now. This is a commonality. This isn't some special subset of early adopters or tech industry people or whatever it might be. This is just everyday people. Everyday people are listening to podcasts. They're talking to their devices. They're using it to navigate their way home in the car. Like, we're all doing it, right? And to really hammer that point home, just take AirPods, for example, as just one medium of doing this. If AirPods themselves as a product line were a separate business from all of Apple, they would be bigger than Nvidia or Adobe on the stock market in terms of units sold. Right. And so just think about how big a just marketplace that is, just being able to be accessible via Siri, via just AirPods, not even every other device that Apple makes. This is commonality now. And I think particularly I'm sure this conversation will head, someone's going to say metaverse at some point or other, so I'm going to ring the klaxon early. But whether we end up spending 10 minutes a day in a VR headset or all day wearing Apple's eyeglasses that they are inevitably going to release, what do you think AirPods are there to do? They're training wheels for us to have these things attached to our faces at all times and control them with our voices. As our friend Ian Utilli from Attention Live often says, the metaverse, to be successful, doesn't operate at the speed of fingers on keyboards or thumbs on glass. It has to operate at the speed of sound, because otherwise you're just not going to be able to interact with it, right? Yeah. So, it's kind of like the early days of, the Palm Trio trying to use a tiny little stylus to click around on a keyboard. That didn't work. And the same is going to be true of, typing inside your Oculus headset or anything else. So this is the direction of travel in terms of the way in which people will interact with consumer technology. And I emphasize the word consumer there. And therefore, if you're trying to hire people, they're consumers too, to your point, Martin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I totally agree, and ultimately, we, as marketers, or marketers, or however you want to call yourself, we have to go where we have to meet people where they are, and if that's the trend that's going on, then we have to go along. We have to meet them there. Absolutely. So I want to just hold it there, and I want to move on to Ron for a few minutes. I know he's been waiting patiently, very, very patiently. One of the things that JP mentioned earlier was about content optimization, and we know that there's been this big push in marketing and in recruitment to do kind of inbound marketing and inbound recruitment. A lot of that is involved in generating a plethora of written content. So I want to kind of come on to you, Ron, and talk a little bit more about Trinity, and about how organizations are taking that written content they've spent years upon years upon years creating quite a high cost, and getting further value out of that by optimizing it and converting it into audio. So over to you.
So I think I want to refer to something that JP said, and I think that's definitely it resonates, at least for me, and I guess for everybody that is part of this ongoing audio and voice revolution, is when the pandemic started, and people stopped commuting, basically, which was probably in most cases most of the time that they listened to audio, driving a car or very much. But when you look at the stats for 2021, consumption in audio increased between, depends where you're checking, but between 8 to 10%. So we are now listening even more. So it's not something that we may use during our commuting time because it was convenient for us. It's something that we really enjoyed doing, and we want to repeat doing it. So it's now going throughout the day, and it will just continue on growing. And I think that we have a saying in our company that if content is king, then definitely distribution and consumption is the queen. If you are creating an amazing content, and it doesn't really matter if it's a video or text or audio, you want to distribute it in as many different channels that you can. Now, taking textual asset that is in a read form, turn it into audio and have it available, you are just opening yourself as a content creator. And it doesn't really matter if you are a newspaper or a brand or an organization looking to recruit new employees. You are offering them the option to engage with your content in a mindset that is comfortable for them. And I think this is the most important thing is we go with our vision forward, saying that you are always talking about content as the maybe the most important thing as a brand that you can have to be heard, basically, or to be listened to, or to be read, or to be watched, and you need to have it in as many forms as possible, because you don't know how your customers or users or future employees would like to consume this content. And this is what we are trying. This is what we are trying to pitch and to say that you have great content, have it available and accessible in as many forms as possible and in as many devices or platforms as possible. So it's having it accessible on Alexa or Google Home, but also have it accessible on Spotify, as well as your website and your app, and so on. I can give a few examples from what we are seeing. And by the way, it's not only about recruitment, but it's also for existing employees. We see companies that are using our solution, which basically, again, takes their content, turn it into audio and have it accessible. And they see that it's easier for them to either update employees, get them more engaged with what's going on within the company. Because in many cases, I'm going out of the office, I definitely want to listen about, I don't know, a new release that the company made, or a new PR offering, or something like that. And having the option to listen to it while I'm, riding my bike, or I don't know, doing the dishes, it's giving me more time throughout the day to communicate with the company that I work with, and have be updated on the new things that are going on in the company itself. So it's not only about the recruitment; it's also relevant for the employees themselves. Beside the fact that everybody that I ask, if this panel or industry or whatever, we came to a situation where we definitely wanted to read something but we just entered the car, or we just had to wash the dishes, or I don't know if somebody's now holding a baby, which is what's happened for me more than once, and I really want to consume a piece of content. So I had one AirPod on my ear, another one listening to the baby, and just having that. I don't know how it resonated for me being a perfect dad, but I'll leave that aside. But that's a need that we have almost on a daily or weekly basis. And I think that it's important for companies to understand that if you invest so much in creation of content, you should also have at least the same amount of consideration to the form of the consumption and places of distribution. And I think that that's something that and my guess, the viewer here in the panel can definitely relate to that. You see the movement. You see people that didn't talk about audio strategy and organizations that didn't talk about audio strategy 2-3 years ago now talking about audio strategy, talking about voice strategy, talking about being heard, talking about how they can be unique within this new ecosystem and basically be where their users, consumers, employees are.
No, that's really cool, and lots of real kind of thinking points and talking points coming out of that. One of the things that really quite strikes me actually is quite obvious and something we haven't really talked about right now is thinking about audio as part of your DE&I strategy, your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, because ultimately, there are people out there that are either restricted when it comes to sight, or even maybe neurodiverse, who really struggle to consume content in the written form. And actually something we've not really spoken about on this so far is actually the impact on that DE&I when it comes to audio compared to written or visual. I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that, or anything that anybody's seeing out there in terms of how audio is impacting on that side of things.
I can share a few things about that, because I think that in regards to audio, in regard to the accessibility aspect of it, we talk a lot about blind and visually impaired, but it doesn't stop there, because we have people that have a problematic reading skills, or in many countries we usually talk about about Europe or the US, but if you go to other countries, you also have problem with illiteracy, where ton of the population have smartphones and they know how to use it and they understand the language. They have hard time reading a specific written content, and then you basically democratize the content by offering it in an audio form, which I think is super important. And I think that if I'm going back to brand and maybe to sonic branding and to voice branding also with that, and seeing that there are an increase in voice avatar. Again, you can, as a brand, create your own unique voice. I always give the obvious example. Take George Clooney, put it in a studio, record his voice, turn it into a text-to-speech engine, and then any type of interaction between a client to an espresso would be in George Clooney voice, and it makes sense, and then basically, first of all, you have all your brand values and uniqueness due to the fact that the talent that represent you as a brand is basically first line of engagement with the customer. You have the access of it as well, which I think is super important. And not only on the legal side of it, it's truly important. As a client in many different forms, I can be non-accessible for a specific content. It will be super helpful for me if I have the option to communicate either with the voice, and of course then output voice, input audio, or the other way around. So I think it's super important, and we are seeing a movement into that direction. I'm still not thinking it's enough, but it's definitely increasing year over year.
No, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. JP, are organisations coming to you specifically with that as part of the outcomes of their strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so we're seeing brands particularly interested in, as Ron alluded to, what we kind of generally call this area of synthetic voice creation in particular. So that's whether that's the recreation of an existing real person's voice, a la the George Clooney to Nespresso example, which is an obvious one, in particular when it comes to utilizing otherwise very expensive talent and not always having to get them back in a vocal booth, and being able to extrapolate from kind of a voice model to power many other things. We've been working on this for some time now, but we announced a partnership with Veritone just before Christmas around their Marvel AI technology, which is doing exactly that, bringing synthetic voices to conversational experiences along those lines, to what Ron's kind of explained there, whether that's customer service lines, whether that's voice applications, or even doing things like fully transposing podcasts from one language into another. We're now able to do things like that, where we can recreate a individual's voice and take that voice and turn it into another language, and it sounds like a person who's never spoken Spanish before in their life can speak fluent Spanish in near real time as well. And there are other companies out there doing some of the things. So we're definitely seeing an interest in this. One, because of a cost saving perspective, we've alluded to there. Also, though, in some cases, and you mentioned about kind of the D&I strategy, in terms of creating experiences that are fair and equitable for people. One of the things we've seen a lot of trend of in the past 5 years or so is the move for when people are recruiting to do kind of blind CV analysis, not seeing the names of people, not necessarily doing audio or video interviews, certainly at first pass, so as not to introduce any kind of racial, gender or age biases. And I think we're going to see similar things happening there in as you begin to be able to plug in these synthetic voice models into things like recruitment platforms. You can imagine a time very soon where you'll be able to go onto Zoom and choose one of a number of different voices that you want your voice to sound like, turn the camera off, and you can have an entirely non-binary, non-racial, kind of biased name and voice to do a first pass interview, which could well have a huge impact on kind of making that first pass of recruitment much more fair to those who often coming from kind of backgrounds that would otherwise be not considered into certain roles. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities when it comes to that too. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, I mean, we all know, unfortunately, that is the real life situation where if you interview somebody who's got a name that is foreign to your country, or a voice that's foreign to your country, that you're less likely to pass that kind of first screening. And it's really unfortunate, but actually it blows my mind when you start thinking about almost personal branding when it comes to audio. And actually that's, so I've got Ben nodding his head furiously here. We might bring him in on this conversation because it looks like he might have something to say, but that's actually kind of blown my mind a little bit, because we were talking about kind of from the employer perspective, but actually from the job seeker perspective, there's a lot to think about when it comes to how, from a personal branding perspective, you can use audio. But go on, Ben. It looks like you're chomping at the bit to say something.
No, I'm kind of a minimalist. Honestly, exactly what you just said is what I wanted to say. That, we're looking at this from the employer perspective, but from personal branding, we all have our voices. We might not love them, but we're used to using these instruments and expressing ourselves. So then suddenly when you have the option to select from a pool of 20, 50 different voices, then it becomes, how do I want to sound? Which voice represents the personality I want to project? And then people are going to want to learn how to select voices. There's a whole area of training, walking people through that, because it's a totally different way of thinking. But definitely, what JP was talking about, I can see that's a perfect use case. It makes me think of the documentary style where somebody doesn't want to be shown on screen, so you see basically their shadow, and then they have someone else's voice, and it means you only get their story without making any sort of assumptions about who that person is.
That's really, I mean, we could have a whole separate show on this. This is actually just, my mind has literally started kind of whirring overtime right now on thought process questions and conversations around that. John looks like he wants to say something. John, do you want to jump in on that?
I just wanted to weigh in on that, talking about personal brand. And I think when you have so many, I love all this technology, all these solutions. As a as an audio branding person, I feel like this sort of weird groupie to the voice domain. There's a whole lot of overlap, but I'm just amazed by the technology. But talking about personal brand, I think when it comes to voice technology, that opens a whole other discussion, because as a sonic brander, part of it is voice, and I work with a lot of voice performers, voiceover artists, with performance and sort of directing and coaching, and it's always a matter of striking a balance between presenting yourself the best you can, but presenting yourself in a way that is authentic and that is genuine and that is going to genuinely connect with people. And I think over the next several years, that's going to be one of the challenges as well in voice technology, is finding that balance between the two.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on that authenticity point as well. And you mentioned, Martin, earlier, this isn't just about external communications, but sometimes can also be about internal and the role of the individual. And John, you mentioned about the personal brand side of things like this. I think particularly with this synthetic side of things, with the translation capabilities and the platforms that we're seeing marketers use now for internal communications, things like internal podcasts, obviously town halls, webinars, Zoom, all this kind of thing. I would not be surprised, knowing the cost that it takes to make some of these synthetic voices, created now to such high level of fidelity. If you're the CEO of, I don't know, JP Morgan, or kind of a Unilever or someone like that, and you've got people all around the world in many different languages, English not always their mother tongue. If I was that CEO in that position with 100,000 people reporting to me, I'd want my voice created. I'd want my voice that could work in every single language and it sound like me. And also, crucially, I don't want to sit in a vocal booth and sit out and read all of that stuff all the time as well. I may not be available that much. So I could be, kind of having my ghostwriters write me, which they're doing anyway, right? Like, let's not be realistic. Like, these CEOs aren't writing their own speeches half the time anyway. But I also don't even have to necessarily spend that time for an hour on a town hall, recording that, particularly if it's not an interactive one. I can just show up for the Q&A. Why do I have to spend half an hour of my time delivering a speech that could be synthetically delivered, and not only delivered in English, but delivered actually in the mother tongue of all the people hearing it? So, from a personal branding perspective, you still want to retain that trust, empathy, and authenticity that comes with my specific voice. Or as Ben said, we're used to using our instruments. I can now have that instrument, and much like kind of taking my kind of Gretsch guitar and plugging it into kind of a different amp modeler, I can do the same thing but with my voice into different languages, and it will still sound like my instrument but coming through maybe a different amplification. So I think that kind of use case, particularly for not for everybody, but for those companies where I'm paying millions of dollars to these senior executives and their time is worth hundreds of thousands per day, maybe it's worthwhile doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, I mean, it throws open the entire conversation around kind of authenticity and transparency, because you don't know whether that might kind of flip over the precipice when people realize it's synthetic compared to it feeling more authentic if it's kind of delivered live. But that's a conversation for an entirely different time. But it does raise the opportunities again, kind of in the employer branding and recruitment marketing piece, where actually if you're branding out globally to especially nowadays, where in a lot of organizations it doesn't really matter where you live to do your job. So ultimately, there's really good opportunities there again from an employer branding perspective, where you can actually get in front of people from all over the world in their mother tongue. And I think that's really, really a really interesting point to think about. Look, we're coming towards the end of the hour that we put aside for this, and the conversation has gone off on tangents that I didn't even imagine it was going to go off on, which is fantastic. And it's always a good thing, I think, for a show like this, where we get into some really juicy conversations. So for the next couple of minutes, anybody can ask questions at any time, and I know we've had a few comments come through. But if people do have any questions, throw them in, because we'll cover some off at the end of the show. But until we get to that point, I just wonder whether we can talk through, because ultimately, hopefully, we've given people who are listening in or watching or whatever they're going to do to consume this this show. But hopefully, they have got some real food for thought and potentially will start thinking about utilising audio as part of their employer branding, their recruitment marketing, even their personal branding. So what happens next? How do you find, and I'll open this up to everyone, how do you find organizations start their journey when it comes to audio? John?
Yeah, I'll just sort of give my perspective. It's from a sonic branding perspective. It really starts with digging deeper and just getting to the core of who you actually are, and again, building that emotional depth. And I think that's something that COVID did in the very early stages of the pandemic was it exposed a lot of the um, a lot of lack of brand self-awareness, because what happened when the whole business world was turned upside down, you got a series of commercials that were basically all the same. And if you're interested, there's actually a YouTube clip out there called "Every COVID Commercial is Exactly the Same," and it's amazing because they pick up on all the patterns and all the cliches, because they all started with shots of empty stores and empty factories, and the voiceover came on and said, "In these troubled times, in these unprecedented times." And then it sort of built, they sort of tried to take the inspirational approach, and it's like, "Since 19 blah blah blah, we've been there for you," and it just sort of culminates to a reveal of a logo. And it really just showed, again, that lack of emotional depth, and to build a sonic identity, that's essential in the process. You have to dig deeper to get to that emotional core. And so many brands, when they were forced to dig deeper and to adapt and pivot, as we like to say, they found they didn't have a big enough shovel, quite frankly. And it was amazing. And the ones that were able to do it right, the ones that did adapt to the times, were the ones that had a very well-defined sonic identity. They knew what their melodies and what their tones and what their voice sounded like. And all they had to do was just dial it back a little bit, just to adapt to the changing social climate. And those were the ones that succeeded.
Cool, thank you. And that's I'm gonna have to dig out that YouTube clip, and if I find it, I'll add it to the email that goes out after this. So I think that's really cool. I'm really looking forward to trying to find that. JP, did you want to jump in on how kind of businesses, organizations are starting their journey?
I think so. Lots of people come to us particularly from one of two perspectives. Sometimes they come at it from where John's kind of starting point, usually around like we already know we have a sonic identity, but we don't have it codified, we don't have it structured, we don't have a means of kind of scaling it up. The other direction that people often come in is usually with a business problem that they're trying to solve, and they think there's an opportunity that voice and audio in particular may do that. Often that's a communications problem. There's this tricky subject that we can't really kind of get across in 140 characters or through a series of TikTok videos. How do we do that in a either conversational format or a long form discussion? And that's where we end up in the discussions around conversational apps or podcasts or other things. Or they've got a cost saving issue, which is, Ron mentioned earlier, at the customer service side of things, right? I've got 80% of the questions that come through our customer service line, kind of are things that can be triaged by a bot, but we don't want something that sounds horrible. We don't want something that sounds automated. We want it to have empathy. And usually what we'll do in that process is go on a kind of what we call a voice strategy discovery process, which is really to help understand the user needs, the behaviors, the wants, the desires from that user. Think about where voice and audio fits within their day already. And particularly because, as Ben alluded to earlier, voice is a different medium and audio is a different medium. We use it differently than we use screens. And in the past, I think a lot of people, when mobile came along after the web on the desktop, people were like, right, let's just do everything we did on the website and now do it in a mobile form. And then suddenly people realize, well, that doesn't work because the form factor is different. It travels around with you. It's not connected to a continuous Wi-Fi connection and you're using your thumbs to control it, right? Okay, we've got a control problem. The same thing happened then when apps and the web kind of moved into social. People were like, well, let's just do what we were doing over here in a one-to-one environment, in a public environment on social media, and that didn't work either. And now we've got the same problem with voice, is people going, well, let's just do everything that our website does and some of what our social media customer services people are doing and some of what our website does, and just smash it all into the voice medium because that's how people control it. And that, funnily enough, doesn't work either. So we have to go on this journey of understanding, where does voice fit in? And what we know is that voice fits in around our pre-existing habits and routines. It's one of the best-selling books of the past couple of years. I reference it all the time, Atomic Habits by James Clear. I'm sure many of you have read it. But this idea around habit stacking is just such an powerful concept that comes from that book, which is that most people, when it comes to using voice devices, or when we turn to use our voice as opposed to a keyboard or our thumbs, is because we're already doing something else. And it's often for these routine, habitual tasks. So what that means is that no, not everything that you do on your website, if you're, kind of a garage door salesman, is going to, funnily enough, it's not going to translate directly into, kind of a voice experience. People just aren't going to do it. So what we have to do is strip back the problem and help people understand what users really want and need, and then only serve the conversations that make sense. Comes back to that idea of conversational objectives. So if you're a kind of bigger brand or company thinking about this, and you've got some money and time to dedicate to it, that's the process that we would usually start with, and then we build back up from there into the world that that John and Ron particularly have kind of got, which is around, okay, what are the audio solutions that come to bear once we've determined the right conversation to have and the right place to have it. But I would always say, if you don't know where you're supposed to be having the conversation, you don't even know what the conversation is, it's kind of like showing up with a kind of a megaphone to Chinese whispers. It's not a great idea. So you've got to kind of work out what you want to be saying and where you want to be saying it first.
No, that's great. So look, we're actually at the top of the hour now. So and we've had no questions come in, which is absolutely fine. I think that's sometimes a good sign. It means that we've covered a hell of a lot, and I think we have. And there's so much more that we could cover. So what I'll do is I'll be emailing everybody a copy of the recording, a link to the recording. I'll add in a link to all of your LinkedIn profiles as well. So if anybody wants to continue the conversation, they can do on a one-to-one basis if need be. But in the meantime, I just want to say thank you so much to the four of you for joining me today. I know you've all got very, very busy schedules. We were talking before we went live just how busy everyone is, which is fantastic. So thank you very much, John, JP, Ron, and Ben. Really, really appreciate your time today. And hopefully everybody's got something out of this. But in the meantime, hope everyone has a good rest of the day wherever they are in the world. And look forward to speaking to you all separately about this all very soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Martin.